It's the year 1991, the fall of the Soviet Union. The story of how the largest empire in history came down completely in less than 3 years, all because a certain Russian man with a birthmark on his forehead thought that maybe completely suppressing all dissidents wasn't the best course of action. Of course, when Gorbachev started his liberalization policies, he and his comrades in arms didn't realize just how unpopular the Communist Party had become all across the Eastern Bloc by the late 1980s. And looking back at it now, maybe giving the common people an opportunity to express themselves freely against a regime that suppressed all criticism for the last 70 years wasn't the greatest of ideas. Gorbachev genuinely believed that by allowing the regular folk certain freedoms and promises of a better future, the people might give communism another chance. And he also urged his allies in the Warsaw Pact to follow his example as well. Long story short, people were not having that. Within mere months, the Soviet Union went from just being a country with a stagnating economy and a messy political system to an empire dying right in front of the whole world. Taking the example of the peoples of Eastern Europe, the Soviet Republic of Lithuania would be the first to secede in March 1990. Following Lithuania, the Soviet people took to the streets not to demand reform or liberalization, but to outright denounce the Communist Party. Protests and riots broke out in cities across the Union as the ethnic tensions boiled. What was seen as a fairly benevolent little attempt to open the country ended up killing it. To put it simply, the Communist Party was out of touch. They didn't imagine that the people would just walk out of the system if they just opened the door a little bit. In a last-ditch attempt at preserving the collapsing Union, Gorbachev decided to enact a radical reform treaty that would see the complete reorganization of the Soviet Union as a decentralized confederation without the monopoly of the Communist Party. And yet again, this too wouldn't go down well, as the high-ranking officials within the Communist Party, who were even more out of touch than Gorbachev, decided to overturn the new Union Treaty by staging a coup in Moscow in August 1991, and to their surprise, the coup found little to no support, and the whole thing ended up accelerating the collapse. In the following weeks, all seceding republics of the Soviet Union proceeded to ban the Communist Party as they saw it as a threat to their national sovereignty. By 25 of December 1991, the day Gorbachev resigned and the red banner came down in Kremlin, the party was illegal in the entirety of the former Soviet Union. And just like that, an era was over. But whenever this story is told, one detail is often left out. What happened to all these people? In contrast to what many outside of the former Soviet Union would think, the story doesn't end here. Whenever the fall of the Soviet Union gets mentioned, people typically think of the time when the drunk man with 8 fingers climbed on top of a tank to defeat communism, and then he danced a little before handing the key to Putin. Now this is technically true, but there's more to the story. When the Soviet Union collapsed, a lot of the men who were in charge of their respective republics simply remained in charge, and were left with no higher authority to answer to. Now, this also was the case with Russia. Even after the Soviet Union formally disbanded, its local parliament, known as the Supreme Soviet of the Russian Federation, continued to function as if nothing had happened. And the problem was that the last Russian parliamentary election was held in 1990, under entirely democratic circumstances. And since the parliament was composed of deputies elected under the Soviet system and was quite hostile to open market ideas, the Supreme Soviet technically continued to be the source of power in Russia well into 1992, and was almost as powerful as the president. However, Yeltsin refused to yield to the parliamentary authority and started initiating economic reforms without the approval of the parliament, in a move that was deemed autocratic, which is a bit ironic. Yeltsin believed that a shock therapy was necessary to transform the Russian economy into a capitalist one, which, as the name suggests, required a brief period of economic distress and expecting the markets to stabilize themselves. This was successful in Poland and Hungary, so why not Russia? The impact of the shock therapy was quickly felt by the general population, as the economy completely crashed within months and the living standards collapsed so hard that the national population started to decline for the first time since Germany invaded the Soviet Union. The policies were met with widespread criticism, and even Yeltsin's own vice president Alexander Rutskoy went on to criticize them in very gentle words, with the quote, "This is economic genocide against the Russian people." Naturally, Yeltsin and the communist-filled parliament did not get along very well. In the end, Yeltsin tried to dissolve the Supreme Soviet on 21st September to assume rule by decree, and the Supreme Soviet in return decided to impeach Yeltsin and replace him with his deputy Rutskoy. Yeltsin said no, and following a 2-week constitutional crisis that resulted in the shelling of the parliament building that nearly destroyed the Russian state, the Supreme Soviet was dissolved, and Yeltsin passed a new constitution that put himself in the center of the state, so he could continue his economic disaster. This still wasn't the end of the story. Soon, the newly reformed Russian Communist Party would re-enter the Russian parliament in the elections in a shockingly powerful way. But before that, let us look at regions outside of Russia. At the time the USSR fell, the Communist Party wasn't just a political party, it was the entire elite of the Union. In some republics, namely the Baltics, the party elite had no problem with distancing itself from the Soviet past, while in some other countries, the party elite didn't actually go anywhere and instead formed new regimes that kept the party elite in power. In nearly all Central Asian states, the party practically continued its rule under different names and without communism. However, without the checks and balances imposed by Soviet leadership, these countries quickly descended into personalistic dictatorships famous for their ridiculously corrupt nature. In Turkmenistan, for example, President Sapar Murat Niyazov, who renamed the Turkmen Communist Party into the Democratic Party of Turkmenistan, established an isolationist totalitarian dictatorship so bizarre that it could easily compete with North Korea. And the only reason why you don't hear about it so often is because Turkmenistan doesn't have a nuclear program. Despite the absurdity of the regime, the party remains in power over 30 years later. Those who wished to form their own communist party were quickly silenced and imprisoned, if lucky. Even though not as totalitarian, identical regimes were founded in virtually all Central Asian states, where the Communist Party elite simply rebranded themselves to stay in power. Some of these regimes would go on to liberalize themselves, others did not, and some were violently overthrown, such as in Kyrgyzstan. In other regions of the former USSR that did not fall victim to authoritarianism, the party reconstructed itself in various ways, and some parties even achieved significant success throughout the 1990s. In nations such as Moldova, Ukraine, and Armenia, the Communist Party drew support from those nostalgic for the Soviet Union, and in some cases, managed to enter government. In fact, in 1993, what was left of the national leadership of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union reorganized itself with the participation of these parties, under the leadership of late Soviet politician Oleg Shenin, who was a high-ranking member of the Gorbachev administration. So it can be said that not even the party itself went away, but just fell out of power. And it also can be said that the party lost its original budget, but that's just speculation. The members of this new Soviet Communist Party proved to be highly popular across the stagnating former Soviet Union. As tens of millions were struggling with the crippling economy and neoliberal economic policies, many people started to see the collapse of the Soviet Union as a mistake and turned to the Communist Party in return. And after a messy launch in 1993, the Communist Party of Russia became the largest political party in the country in the 1995 elections. But since they couldn't form a parliamentary majority, they weren't able to prevent Yeltsin's policies. But in 1996, President Yeltsin almost saw the Grim Reaper on his doorstep as the Communist Party leader Gennady Zyuganov pushed forward his candidacy at a time when Yeltsin's approval ratings fell below 10%. By 1996, practically everyone in Russia already accepted that Yeltsin's policies were a complete disaster, and it was obvious that things were not going to get any better from now on. And according to the polls at the time, Zyuganov was basically guaranteed to win, as nobody thought they would vote for Yeltsin again considering the state of the economy. But after one of the most absurd electoral campaigns in modern history, that involved numerous political tricks with dubious legality, foreign intervention, and unconfirmed reports of outright vote rigging, Yeltsin won. I won't get into the details, but this was quite the insane story. They even made a movie about it starring Jeff Goldblum of all people. Would highly recommend it, it's really underrated, and I might cover this event in a future video. But anyway, the communists lost. And even though Zyuganov knew full well that this was not a free election, he didn't push to challenge the results to avoid repeating any past crisis. But the communists wouldn't stop there. 3 years later, similar to Russia, during the 1999 Ukrainian presidential elections, the leader of the Ukrainian Communist Party, Petro Simonenko, made it to the second round of the election but was defeated. The Ukrainian communists would continue being a significant force in Ukrainian politics until 2014. They even became a part of the national government on numerous occasions. And also many do not know this, but the only country in which the Communist Party successfully came back to power was Moldova. The former Soviet politician Vladimir Voronin was successfully elected as president in 2001 and dominated Moldovan politics throughout the 2000s. During his presidency, Voronin pursued both pro-Russian and pro-EU foreign policy, and mind you, this was before Ukraine, tried to find a resolution to the breakaway Transnistria region, and encouraged big state economy, but refrained from nationalizing private enterprise out of fear of losing public support, which wasn't very communist of him to do so. However, the rule of the Communist Party came to an end in the Moldovan political crisis of 2009, and Voronin resigned in shame. The party was unable to come back to power ever since, but continues to be a prominent force inside of Moldova to this day, alongside their allies. In Belarus, the situation is a bit complicated. Initially, the country was headed in a pro-Western path under the direction of the acting president Stanislav Shushkevich. But following what can I only describe as the most ridiculous story of the rise to power. In 1993, the member of the parliament Alexander Lukashenko, who was tasked with investigating corruption within Belarus, accused Shushkevich and his government of corruption. And even though the nature of the accusation was dubious, Lukashenko humiliated the government so badly that he caused a motion of no confidence that toppled the entire government. Lukashenko became a hero in the eyes of the people and proceeded to win the following presidential election with a mind-staggering 80% of the votes. Now, Lukashenko never actually identified as a communist after becoming the president in 1994, but he was, and still is, absolutely the most Soviet leader in the former Soviet Union, even more than communist Voronin. In 1991, he was the only lawmaker in the entire Belarusian parliament to vote against the dissolution of the USSR. And immediately after coming to power in 1994, Lukashenko denounced the idea of shock therapy and instead advocated for socialist economic reforms. He then organized two referendums in 1995 and 1996, which practically turned Belarus back into a Soviet republic, giving the president extraordinary powers, made Russian an official language alongside Belarusian, and even changing the national flag and emblem back to the Soviet-era one. And even though he never affiliated himself with any party, Lukashenko receives the support of the Reformed Communist Party of Belarus to this day, which was founded almost purely to support the Belarusian government. It can be said that under Lukashenko, Belarus truly became a rump state of the Soviet Union. But as the 2000s rolled around, communism declined for a second time. The most prominent reason was the departure of Yeltsin and the arrival of Putin. The thing is, the primary reason behind the rise of post-Soviet communism wasn't just nostalgia for an era when everyone lived in a propaganda poster, but rather just the terrible living standards of the time. When Putin came around, he restored the economic order in Russia with the help of rising oil prices, and by 2003 the living standards went up, and Russia was no longer classified as a lower middle-income economy by the World Bank, and communism, to say the least, was no longer trendy. During this time, people's perceptions of what should be the definition of communism varied widely, as it basically lost all its original meaning. Many saw Soviet history as a central part of Russian history and started perceiving the idea of communism through the lenses of Russian nationalism and Soviet nostalgia. But people besides the Russians in the former Soviet Union always regarded communism as an instrument of Russian hegemony rather than a political ideology. For some, this was a source of pride, and for others, not very much. In Ukraine, for example, the support for the Communist Party was almost exclusive to the Russian-speaking regions of the country, while for people outside of these regions, communism was just a tool to keep the minorities in line. This is why today across former Eastern Europe, even the symbols of communist rule are strictly banned. While in Russia itself communism took a strange turn, many accused the actual Communist Party of being revisionist, while others accused it of not being revisionist enough. All sorts of ideas were put forward during this time, some rather understandable, while others were utterly insane and, may I even dare to say, based. In the 1990s, despite having a capitalist pro-Western president, Russia underwent what only can be described as a booming political extremism industry, where everyone had their own concept of what a new Russian totalitarian dictatorship should look like. As you might know, in times of crisis, people often turn to politicians who espouse extremist positions and solutions. Russia in that regard was basically a flea market for extremism. Many other politically extreme parties were founded, such as the Russian Communist Workers' Party, which called the actual Communist Party revisionist garbage, and even got 4% of the votes in the 1995 election. They later merged with another small communist party and changed their name to this, which I am not reading aloud to save time. There were even more fringe movements, such as people trying to revive the Trotskyist movement within Russia, and even national Bolsheviks, or literally Nazi communists. However, as expected, all these parties except for the actual Communist Party eventually fell into obscurity. Yet, This new communist movement actually had a profound impact on the Russian-speaking world and continues to shape Russian society to this day. Thanks to this movement, we now have contemporary geniuses such as Alexander Dugin and Dmitry Puchkov, aka Goblin. But those who were critical had a name for this mindset, the Vatnik, aka people who blend far-left extremism with far-right extremism the way they see fit, with a schizophrenic blend of Soviet and Tsarist nostalgia. You can also throw in some Slavic neo-paganism in there too, just in case. As you might know, Putin isn't exactly a democracy lover, and his attitude towards domestic opposition varied between these three things: slippery stairs, cyanide, and plane crashes. At the start of his presidency, Putin didn't immediately go after the opposition after coming to power and actually pursued a lukewarm policy against the liberal opposition, right before taking a total U-turn and brutally steamrolling the liberal opposition. But the thing is, you can be an opposition figure as long as you are not a pro-Western liberal or an ethnic separatist. And of course, as long as you don't actually try to dismantle the system, because the government regards these organizations and politicians as possible sources of rebellious thinking, which is something that Western powers could exploit to stage a color revolution in Russia. So Putin isn't willing to take any risks in allowing open opposition. However, if you are a Lenin-loving red-blooded communist, or a radical ultra-nationalist monarchist, or a schizoid who forgot to take his medicine, then you are actually quite free to express yourself, within the Russian standards, at least. In the 2000s, as Putin and his mates further trenched themselves into the government, the Communist Party leadership quietly resigned to the reality that there was simply no way for them to enter the government anymore. And with the fact that Putin went on to start actively encouraging Soviet nostalgia and distanced himself from Yeltsin, many people who were in it just for the sake of old-time nostalgia also left the party. And to be honest, the party leadership wasn't really happy about being narrowed down to just symbolic opposition to give Putin's government some legitimacy. But when it came to picking between sitting on a clean seat inside the State Duma and Slippery Stairs World Championship, the decision was easy to make. For the next 2 decades, communists were given permission to stage non-violent rallies and participate in elections. Their candidates were even allowed to win several offices, including mayors and governors. During this time, the party proceeded to soften its tone on economic and social issues and adopted a more nationalistic version of communism that focused on Soviet nostalgia rather than actual Soviet-era policies, and most significantly abandoned the desire to return to a total command economy. Instead, the party leadership started to idolize the Chinese model for development. Additionally, the party even had a reconciliation campaign with the Orthodox Church to get away from the reputation that communists are the enemy of religion. The party leader Zhuganov himself would later go on to identify himself as a Christian communist, which is a bit ironic for obvious reasons, and despite never reaching the same level of popularity ever again, the Communist Party did actually pretty well considering the fact they operate within a managed democracy, with some internal squabbling here and there. Their vote share was regularly somewhere around 10 to 20%, and even though they weren't completely exempted from getting persecuted from time to time, they actually garnered something of a loyal supporter base in parts of the country in the region known as the Red Belt. This would continue to be the status quo for quite some time. However, the change would come, as always. In the late 2010s, the Russian economy was in bad shape, which would only get aggravated by the pandemic lockdowns. The people were struggling with the crippling economy, and Putin's approval ratings fell to an all-time low, all the way down to 58%. And while this may seem high, especially if you live in a democratic first world country, where your leader barely gets 40%, this was a nightmare by Putin's standards. However, at the same time, the approval rating of Prime Minister Medvedev fell to just 33%, which is arguably worse. With nearly all major liberal opposition figures either dead or in jail, many Russians who were frustrated with the status quo turned to the only legal major opposition party in the country, the Communists. And just like that, the Reds were on the rise once again, with opinion polls during this time depicting them as around 20%, possibly even higher, only next to United Russia, the party of Kremlin. Since the 90s, the Communist Party was a place without a cause. By 2019, almost half of the members were just nostalgic pensioners. Now, by 2021, the Communist Party actually had the opportunity to do some communism in a very long time. Rally the people around the banner and take their demands to the Kremlin like some Soviet propaganda painting. Now, with an escalating wave of dissent and dissatisfaction among the population, how does Putin cope with all of this? He assured the Russian people that the election results would be respected regardless of the— I'm just joking, they rigged the election. And the United Russia performed much better than what the polls indicated. The Communist Party was naturally upset, and the leadership even refused to recognize the election results in some regions, including the Moscow area. The Communist Party supporters took to the streets and started calling for more transparent election results. They protested and subsequently got arrested in return. And you might have noticed that the Kremlin doesn't take in such opposition very well. And although the Communist Party leadership didn't fully go all in when it came to supporting the protests, this didn't prevent any retaliation from occurring. The high-ranking party members were indicted, and most were stripped of their influence over the party affairs. Subsequently, the Communist Party became pacified and much more in line with the Kremlin. However, the real blow would come a few months later. While it went mostly unnoticed outside of Russia, the invasion of Ukraine produced a massive rally around the flag effect. Putin's approval ratings shot to almost 90%, and suddenly, the people weren't so interested in their living standards conditions after all. And despite the historical attitude communists had toward the international wars, a good majority of the party turned out to be highly supportive of the war as a crusade against the archenemy of communism, NATO. And those who did oppose the war, particularly the younger communists, were quickly silenced, not unlike the rest of Russia. While in Ukraine in 2014, Euromaidan protests overthrew the pro-Russian government in Kiev, and while they were at it, they also ransacked the offices of the Communist Party and destroyed the statues of Lenin across the country. Shortly afterward, the acting government outright banned the Communist Party and communist symbolism across the country. However, the invasion would be a death sentence for any type of sympathy for communism in Ukraine, especially after the party actively collaborated with the Russian invaders, and the fact that the leader of the Ukrainian Communist Party, Petro Simonenko, even escaped to Belarus during the Battle of Kiev with the help of the Russian army, while Russian Communist Party itself became even more subordinate to the Kremlin and rallied its supporter base for the war in Ukraine. Later on, in the completely free and fair presidential elections of 2024, the party received their worst result in its history, with their candidate getting just a little over 4% of the votes. As of 2024, the Communist Party continues to lose relevancy among the Russian public, as it continues to be sidelined by the Kremlin. With this in mind, all the Soviet nostalgic people by now seem to accept what many have realized for decades. The Soviet Union is never coming back. As Putin himself put it, "Whoever does not miss the Soviet Union has no heart. Whoever wants it back has no brain." Thanks for watching.